who graduated from our school in 2016. He is a research assistant with Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, University College of London. Previously, Matthew was with NIMHANS, Bangalore, having opted for one of the less trodden roads, psychology. He will enlighten us about his experiences and challenges. Matthew,
Yes.
over to you.
Can you see me and can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see you and your screen.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about my journey into cognitive neuroscience, which is psychology and neuroscience, and well, I'll explain more as we keep going. This is a video clip that came on a show around 3 weeks ago. So I'm just going to play this very quickly for you.
And finally, we want to show you this. A new prosthetic third thumb could make performing one-handed tasks easier in the future. Here it is here. Look at that. It's called body augmentation, a growing field aimed at extending our physical abilities. Here it is in action right here. It has the potential to increase the efficiency.
Okay, so this was a clip on the Late Late Show with James Corden, which is a very popular American celebrity chat show. So James Corden, he covers, the news, he mentions interesting stuff that's happened, and he talks about this robotic thumb, which extends the function of the human hand. This robotic thumb was actually developed in our lab by us. So this was just me sort of testing out the thumb in the very, very early stages of development. So it was very exciting to see our research sort of reach quite a large audience, and even on celebrity talk shows. And it's not just that. So this is a study of ours which came out around 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it dealt with this robotic thumb. So we give people an extra robotic finger, and we make them do a lot of tasks which is normally done by two hands. So for example, holding a glass while doing something else, etc. And what we were really looking for is whether the brain can sort of accommodate this extra finger. How does the brain sort of deal with it? And as I said, it got a lot of attention. So it came in the Times, we had articles, we had in the Evening Standard, in the Scientific American, and also we had a lot of our team going around doing interviews on BBC and Sky News and all of that, just talking about our research, which was very exciting that our research had actually gone quite far. Okay, so what I want to do today is very simple. I want to talk about psychology and neuroscience as subjects, as career paths. So what these fields are, in case you've not considered it, in case you've not thought about these as options, just to tell you what it involves, and if something sparks your interest, that's great. I'll also talk a little bit about what I do, about my academic path so far, what I've done, and about a little more about a degree in psychology or neuroscience. So I'm just going to talk about psychology first. So psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So that's the official definition according to the American Psychology Association. So very simple, we're studying the mind, we're studying behavior. Neuroscience is similar. Neuroscience studies the nervous system particularly. So in specific, we're studying the brain, we're studying the nervous system. Recently, the difference between psychology and neuroscience is becoming less and less. So research in psychology very rarely ignores the brain now. So you are studying the brain, you are studying the nervous system. Both of them are very, very broad terms. Psychology involves a lot of subdivisions. Neuroscience too involves a lot of subdivisions. Neuroscience, you can study things like individual neurons and the proteins made in neurons, the chemicals that come out at the end of neurons, etc. But you can also study whole brain things like you put people in brain scanners, in MRI scanners, and you're seeing, okay, when you do some task, which part of the brain is activated. So very, very long things. So for example, if you can study the protein that is responsible for Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's disease, you have a very specific protein that grows in neurons and results in. So that's a part of neuroscience. But it's also a part of psychology because you're also studying how that affects movements, how that affects. It's a very interdisciplinary. There's a lot of meshing now between psychology and neuroscience. What are some fields of psychology? So this is a lot of stuff. So I'm probably not going to go over all of them, but I'll mention some of the subdivisions and some of the areas, and maybe some of them might interest you. So clinical psychology is usually what people think of when we think of psychology. It's so it's a psychology of disorders, so of clinical conditions, of mental ill health. So you study things like depression, you study things like psychosis and hallucinations, you study things like well-being, you study therapy, so cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. You have educational and developmental psychology, in which you study things like how do children develop, you study language development, mathematical skills, you study things like autism, etc. You have social psychology, where you study the sense of self, how group processes. You study about prejudice, discrimination, about aggression, about stereotypes, about attitudes. You have industrial psychology, or IO psychology, also called business psychology, where you study things like employee recruitment and training and leadership and motivation and job attitudes. You have sports psychology, where you sort of study about this, all the psychological factors influencing sports, influencing performance, about physical activity, about exercise, how that improves well-being, and how many of them work with athletes in order to utilize psychology to improve performance and mental well-being. You have cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, which is the field I work in. You also have, oh, sorry, I jumped many slides. And you have behavioral economics, which is a very interesting field, I think, which sort of you sort of go into, you use psychological theories about experimentation. You're trying to find out human decision making. So you're studying decision making, particularly how biased we are, and so it's sort of it's the boundary between economics as well. So it's psychology is sort of pushing many fears. And of course, you have forensic or criminal psychology, which a lot of people find interesting, where you study criminal behavior and thoughts, intentions, actions, motivations, etc. Neuropharmacology, this is neuroscience, how medicines affect the brain. You have things like neurophysiology, how neurons work. You have different things like computational and systems neuroscience, where you actually do a lot of coding. So you're trying to simulate the brain. So how do people see an object, and you sort of code different units and try to get them to do that. So it's very coding intensive. Yeah, and just a lot of several fields within these. They're very broad by themselves. What are some jobs people do after a psychology degree? Well, so a lot of people, not a psychiatrist, but you become a clinical psychologist after a psychology degree, where you're sort of, so you identify disorders, you work in therapy, etc. You can work as a forensic psychologist, so criminal psychology, school and career counselors. You can go into academia, social work, mental health counseling, sports psychologist, art therapist, consumer psychologist. So this is where, if you do more business related stuff, you can go into that. And recently I met a few people who've also gone into Facebook and Google as user research interns. So these usually, for example, this is a thing I just pulled off Facebook Career. So this is people they are looking for PhD students. Actually, PhD students are those who've graduated in order to do some sort of general research, so social science research into user experience, how they find platforms. So basically what they want is research tools and quantitative methods, which a degree in psychology, particularly with the PhD, is supposed to equip you with. So that's some careers people go into, very broadly about what psychology is and what people do after. What do? I work in cognitive neuroscience, which is this boundary between psychology and neuroscience. And I work as a research assistant at the moment. So this is usually what people do before they do a PhD. So I'm one step behind Noel, I think. I'm sort of getting some research experience, and I'm supporting research. And we work in this, cognitive neuroscience studies things like memory. So how do people remember? Why do people not remember? What are the different sorts of memory? How can you make it better, worse? We study everything. Perception, vision, how do people see? How do people hear? How do people move? How, voluntary action? These are all topics that come under cognitive neuroscience. In particular, my lab, we study this part of the brain. So this is the somatosensory cortex. This part of the brain is where, so if your brain was open during surgery and I sort of gave you an electric shock somewhere here, what you'd find is you'd find your tongue or your face twitch or your face move. If I stimulated around here, you might find your hand move. And if I stimulated around, more closer, you might feel your feet move. So this is the part that controls movement and feeling as well. And in our lab, we study things like, we study people who've lost a hand, for example. What happens if you lose a hand? What happens to the brain? So we're studying brain plasticity. Can the brain change when you lose different parts of the body? And I find this fascinating. Sometimes, what exactly happens? Does the face become bigger? So if you stimulate the part of the missing hand, do you stimulate the face or near neighboring areas? We also find something very interesting in people who've had an amputation. If people have lost their hand due to an accident or something, we find that they still have pain in a hand that's not there anymore, and it's called phantom pain. So if you stimulate that area, you might trigger pain in a hand they don't have anymore. So that's something we study as well. We study phantom pain. And again, this is one of the such an interesting thing, which I enjoy a lot. And we also study robotic devices. So we study robotic fingers, we study robotic arms. So if they are missing an arm and we give them an extra arm, can this arm be represented in the brain? So basically we're studying we're studying robotics and how the brain deals with it particularly. Yeah, again, this is what we're doing with the third thumb as well. We're trying to see if the third thumb can be represented in the brain, and we put people in brain scanners and all of that. Okay, that's what I do. My academic path so far, I was at Gregorian for 14 years. I took computer science, physics, maths, chemistry, and English in the 11th and 12th, just to sort of keep my options open, because I knew I wanted to do psychology. I wasn't really sure. I was interested in people. I used to read random books on body language and things like that, because I knew I wanted to study people, but I knew I didn't want to go into clinical psychology. So I didn't want to become a therapist. And I wasn't really sure what the other options were. I wanted to do business psychology. I wanted to do neuroscience. But anyway, I wasn't too sure. I wanted to do artificial intelligence and, systems neuroscience and all of that. And I didn't know what the options were. So I applied to universities abroad soon after my 12th, and I got rejected from every university I applied to, which was not nice, but it was good, because it helped me. I took a gap year and I went to NIMHANS, which is the National Institute of Mental Health and Neuroscience. It's a central government hospital / medical school in Bangalore, and I spent a year there doing research. So I worked with the Department of Neurology, and I studied patients with Parkinson's disease. So they have Parkinson's disease results in movement. It's a movement disorder. They have problems with movement. And I helped quantify this movement. So when does movement start getting bad, particularly with handwriting? So handwriting is one of the first things to get bad in Parkinson's disease, even before you can see the tremors or you see the slowness or something like that. So I spent a year there. Research is always valued a lot in universities abroad. So I spent a year, I applied again, and yes, I got accepted for psychology and neuroscience degrees abroad, and I went. But before I went, while I was sort of sorting myself out, I also spent 2 months, maybe 3 months at St. Xavier's in Mumbai, where I did psychology, economics, and stats. So these were the 3 subjects I picked. And St. Xavier's has this very interesting, if you're doing the BA at Xavier's, they have an option where you start off with 3 subjects. And then after the first year, you drop 1 subject. After the second year, you drop another subject, and you major with the last one you have. You can also double major. So it was flexible. So I picked psychology, I picked economics, and I picked stats. I wasn't going to be there long anyway, but it was interesting. But after that, I ended up going to UCL, which is in central London, and I did a BSc in psychology. And it's what I wanted to do. I was also offered a BSc in neuroscience, but I decided to go with psychology, because neuroscience, as you understand, is probably there's more biology involved in neuroscience. It's more about, it can be more biology, more about the chemicals, whereas psychology sort of moves back a little, moves more about behavior, and behavior connected to the brain rather than just the brain. But some of the courses, I really enjoyed my degree. The first year, there was a lot of statistics. There was a lot of maths, because a lot about psychology, I think, at least the way it should be, is that there's a lot of research. Everything you know is based on research, is based on what you've experimented and you found out. So first year, we had 1 psychology module and 5 stats and maths modules. So there was a lot of statistics involved. But in the second year, we had all the options. So I studied memory and decision. I studied genetics and behavior. I studied language. I studied behavior change. So how do you design interventions to change behavior, not just on an individual level, but even on a policy level as well? So how do you change that? I studied health and clinical psychology. So again, disorders. I studied human-computer interaction. I studied neurobiology. So it was very broad. They had very, very several options. And yeah, eventually I ended up in cognitive neuroscience as well, which I enjoy. Okay, a degree in psychology or neuroscience. In India, so I did not do my undergrad in India. I did my undergrad in London. But just looking up and speaking to people who have done, these are some quite good colleges for psychology in India. Lady Sri Ram, well, Delhi University has a lot of good ones, and it's been mentioned by everyone in the past as well. So Lady Sri Ram, Jesus Mary College, they have good degrees in psychology. Christ has a couple of degrees in Bangalore. St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, so it has a good psychology degree. And you also have Rajagiri and St. Teresa's, for example, in Kerala, and they offer psychology degrees. Just going to go a little more into the degrees themselves. I think this is the major difference between a psychology degree in India versus abroad. So in Christ University, again, they have a flexible thing where you can sort of combine psychology with other subjects. So performing arts, English, psychology, sociology, economics, psychology, sociology, English. So you have a lot of mixtures. But in general, in this degree, in most degrees in India, psychology is focused around clinical. So it's focused around developmental, around social, around abnormal psychology, and you have a little bit about industrial psychology, etc. So it's, these are the main focuses. So even in St. Teresa's College, is the clinical psychology, developmental psychology, so about children. So it's sort of working with people very closely is the aim of psychology degrees here. The only exception, I think, is the BSc honors program in psychology, which Christ offers. And this is, I think this was my backup option, I think, if I didn't end up going. So for them, the psychology degree, it's slightly different. They try to introduce subjects like artificial intelligence and biochemistry, so biotechnology, computer science, engineering. So it's building in more, yes, psychology, but sort of bringing a little more depth to that as well. So it's because psychology is broad, and this is a different degree. Interesting if you're interested in coding, if you're interested in technology, if you're interested in artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's an interesting degree, I think. Yep. And what do you need to do actually if you want to get into a degree in psychology? Most universities, especially, don't require any particular stream. So you can take any stream you want. For example, this is even for the BSc honors in psychology at Christ, they say any stream. So it's not, you don't have to do psychology at your undergrad, even though I would recommend that maths really helped me. Also, I was in a sort of a more research-oriented degree, so there was a lot of statistics, which I think you do learn a lot of maths in the 11th and 12th, all of which may not be needed. But if you want to go into machine learning and artificial intelligence anyway, it's a good idea to take maths and computer science. Whereas if you want to work in clinical psychology, I want to work as a therapist, I want to work with children, how children develop, I want to work in education, then you may not need it. You could still, and you really don't like math, then don't take math if you want to go into, if you know the fields you want to go in. But again, I don't think 9, 10, 11, 12, no one is very sure which field they want to, right? So keeping options open might be good as well. Colleges for psychology abroad, well, obviously you Google and you find ratings, and they're Harvard, Stanford, Cambridge, Oxford, etc. So it's different. But what do they require? For example, UCL, what they required was they wanted at least one or preferably 2 subjects in biology, chemistry, maths, physics, and psychology. So as you can see, they are sort of insisting more on science fields as well, as opposed to humanities or arts or anything. But I was okay because I did chemistry and physics and maths, so that was fine. But yeah, maths is probably the most useful to have if you're applying abroad. And if you are applying for a neuroscience degree, if you are interested in the biology of it, chemistry was required. So chemistry is required plus biology or maths or physics. So again, they are sort of hopping on more on the science fields, which is useful. But yeah, several options, very, very broad field, psychology and neuroscience, a lot of, it's just very broad, and there's a lot of opportunities, and it's very young, which is why it's very exciting, these 2 fields. Yes, I'm happy to take any questions or